Are three distinguished speakers in this session. So first I would like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Richard Stoneman, who is the author of several books. Dr. Richard Stoneman was educated at Oxford University and worked for 30 years as an editor at Routledge Publishers. During that time, he began his research on Alexander's romance legend in 2008. In 1990, he was appointed as honorary fellow, now honorary professor at the University of Exeter, and he taught there between 2008 and 2014. His 20-plus books include translation of Greek and Latin works on Alexander, Guidebook to Greece and Turkey, and studies of Greek mythology. Please welcome Richard Stoneman. Sir, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My paper is too long, but nonetheless I'm going to eat into my reading time by beginning by saying a very warm thank you to everybody involved in this conference. First of all, to those who invited me, and also to thank you. Also to those of you who've taken the trouble to attend and ask such interesting questions. Okay, the Kingdom of Musicanus. The description of the Kingdom of Musicanus in Sindh is one of the more detailed sketches of an Indian society that has reached us as part of the ancient accounts of Alexander's campaign. The geographer Strabo, writing about 1 BC, provides a paraphrase of a description written by one of Alexander's accompanying historians, Onesicritus. In addition, he gives us a short description of the locality by another historian, Aristobulus, while the historians whose work survives in full, all writing between 300 and 500 years after Alexander's campaign, all provide narrative accounts of Alexander's expedition through Sindh. It's important to remember that we have only fragmentary remains of all the writers who traveled with Alexander. These fragments consist of quotations in the historians who are our main continuous sources, all of whom were writing 300 or 500 years later. Strabo in particular gives copious extracts or paraphrases from earlier writers, but they chose what interested them and were often unable to resolve contradictions between their sources. Onesicritus' description of the Kingdom of Musicanus is a test case for the ways in which Greek writers approached the interpretation of foreign societies. Herodotus in the 5th century and Ctesias in the 4th century had established certain ways of writing and thinking about foreign societies, which largely involved emphasizing their otherness from the Greeks. A primary purpose of this paper is to examine Onesicritus' reliability and to test what he tells us about Musicanus' people against what we can learn from other sources. It's notable that Onesicritus did not give a comparable treatment, as far as we can tell, to any of the other states in Sindh which Alexander subdued. Perhaps Musica, if we call it that, was the only place where the army stayed long enough for the philosopher to observe the society. Alexander and his army spent the period from November 326 BC to July 325 BC, voyaging down the Indus to its mouth. Their passage was accompanied by fierce fighting all the way. Some scholars have been moved to speak of a reign of terror. Part of the reason must have been the need to obtain adequate food and other supplies, as the country became more arid the further south they went. Brian Bosworth saw it rather as a sign of Alexander's megalomania. Those rulers and cities that sent signs of submission were treated lightly, while those who did not acknowledge Alexander's lordship were massacred. In 1975, Dr. Egermont proposed a third explanation, that Alexander needed to secure his lines of communication to the lands he had left behind, and that Musicanus' kingdom was crucial to this strategic aim. The neighboring tribes of the Mali and of Sambus paid tribute to Arakosea, so presumably Musicanus did too. The region provided, as he says, an important transshipment center for the goods conveyed from Arakosea in Iran to the Indus Valley. The interpretation is somewhat speculative, but provides a third line of thought about Alexander's strategy in the Indus voyage. It would lend strength to the view so forcefully put forward by Professor Lane Fox this morning, that Alexander was not simply abandoning his conquests in India, but was attempting to consolidate his hold systematically on the fringe of his empire as he headed back to Babylon. Let us look more closely at his encounter with the kingdom of Musicanus and the neighboring peoples. The first major encounter I should mention was that with the Mali, Malavas, who were waiting for him with a large and hostile army some 60 miles east of the river Hydraotis, the Ravi. However, Curtius and Diodorus say that he first came to the city of a closely allied people, the Oxydracae or Sudracae, Kshudrakas. The Mali and Sudracae had patched up their quarrels and made common cause against a common enemy, each retiring to defend their own city against the invader. In one or other of these cities, Alexander was severely wounded, and the historians give conflicting accounts of his dramatic rescue from the enemy. This necessitated many days' convalescence because he was severely wounded. Curtius says that the king lay bedridden for 7 days before being moved to a hospital tent on his ship so that the voyage could continue. The episode at the Mali town is the first mention of a city in the Indus voyage. This prompts the question of how far Sind was urbanized at this date. Inclusion in the Achaemenid Empire seems to have provided a stimulus to the growth of cities such as Pushkalavati and Taxila further north. But even if Sind was a satrapy of the empire, as it probably was, it was the furthest from Persia and less susceptible to this kind of influence. The growth of cities may also have been inhibited by the frequent changes of course of the river Indus, what Professor Olchin calls post-urban adaptations to changing environmental demands. Alexander met up with the land army at the confluence with the Indus. Here he received the submission of several peoples and founded a city named Alexandria, which is probably Uch. He appointed the companion, Paethon, satrap of the whole region southwards from here to the sea. The historians do not provide us with sufficient chronological indications to determine when in 325 these events occurred. Progress in the first days of the voyage seems to have been slow, and the massacres must have taken some time. To add to that, a minimum of 7 days convalescence and the foundation of a new city, and we cannot be looking at less than 2 months from departure. We are probably in mid-January 325. Alexander's next target was the kingdom of Musicanus. Arrian describes this as the richest in India. The historian's close focus approach to narrative generally interprets Alexander's actions as motivated by immediate gain, whether pecuniary or romantic, and provides us with little that would help us to analyze the wider strategy of campaign. Alexander reached the kingdom of Musicanus before the latter knew he was coming. He received Alexander with gifts and submission. Alexander installed a garrison, had the citadel fortified. Says Arrian, since the place seemed to him convenient for watching and keeping a hold over the tribes around about. Arrian's interpretation of Alexander's reasoning again sticks to short-term aims rather than strategy. It's evident that the army spent some time there, since Onesicritus found time to write a rather full description of its society. Aristobulus tells us that the region from Patalini, the mouth of the Indus, as far as the Hydaspes, the river Jhelum, receives no rain, in this resembling the region of Egypt from the Thebais to Syene, Aswan. The observation fits with the sojourn here in January or February. Aristobulus goes on to say that when he was sent on a certain mission, he saw a country of more than 1,000 cities, together with villages that had been deserted because the Indus had abandoned its proper bed and had turned aside into the other bed that was much deeper and flowed with precipitous descent like a cataract, so that the Indus no longer watered by its overflows the abandoned country on its right, since that country was now above the level not only of the new stream, but of its overflows. Aristobulus is probably referring not only to recently abandoned villages, but also to the visible ruins of sites from the Indus civilization that had ceased to be occupied a millennium and a half before Alexander's time. It's generally been accepted in the scholarship since Alexander Cunningham that Musicanus' kingdom was centered on Alor, Aror, Rohri, on the east bank of an eastern branch of the Indus. This prominent stronghold was the medieval capital of Sind, and in the 8th century CE, it had strong fortification walls as well as royal buildings, villas, and gardens. One may imagine a similar flourishing town 1,000 years earlier when Alexander came. The location of this kingdom is confirmed by the coordinates of the other principalities Alexander came into contact with immediately afterwards. The first was Oxycanus. Like Musicanus and like Taxiles earlier in the expedition, the ruler has been given the name of the kingdom he ruled. Liniarchic doubts that Musicanus's was in fact a kingdom. Curtius refers rather to a people called Musicani. The Indian ethnonym corresponding to Musicanus is uncertain. Sarkar connects it with the river Musi near Hyderabad, but Aurora, a gentleman, not a place, speculates that the name represents Sanskrit Mushika, perhaps to be identified with the people known in the 19th century as the Mohshis. The Musika are also mentioned in the Mahabharata. I'll skip the quotation. Oxycanus' name has been associated by Egamont with Asica, listed by Ptolemy. Cunningham linked it rather with Oscana, a small stream west of the Indus. The historians other than Arrian all refer to a ruler named Porticanus at this point in the advance. The difference in the two names is surprising if both denote the same person. Arrian seems to have followed a tradition which only mentioned the one, while the others only mentioned Porticanus. Oxycanus was defeated by Alexander, and his next target was a ruler called Sambus, based at Sindimana, which Professor Lane Fox mentioned this morning. Sindimana is generally identified with Sehuan, though as Vincent Smith sardonically noted, Sindimana may or may not have been Sehuan, with which it is commonly identified, for no better reason than that both names begin with S. Cunningham found stronger reasons for the identification, partly from the similarity of name, partly from its vicinity to the Laki Mountains. Of its antiquity there can be no doubt, as the great mound, which was once the citadel, is formed chiefly of ruined buildings. Sehuan dominated the western bank of the Indus as Aror dominated the eastern. By securing the submission of both these kingdoms, Alexander controlled both banks of the Indus northwards, and thus secured his lines of communication back as far as Kandahar. The final conquest by Alexander in this region was the city of the Brahmans, possibly Harmatelia. Cunningham inferred that this city was in fact part of Musicanus' kingdom, in which case Musicanus' sway included most of the Indus delta. But it may be that the Brahman city was semi-independent. Nilakanta Shastri refers to it as Brahmanako Nama Janapada, and citing Patanjali for this description, implying that it had an independent constitutional status, probably as an oligarchy rather than a kingdom. While Alexander was occupied with the conquest of the Brahman city, news reached him that Musicanus had revolted, apparently at the instigation of the Brahmans. Alexander razed the cities of his realm, enslaved the inhabitants, and established a number of garrisons. Musicanus was captured by Paithon, the new satrap of the region, and both the king and the leading Brahmans were hanged or crucified. With these garrisons, Alexander seemed to have established control of the region, including Musicanus' capital. Now the ruler of Patala arrived and offered submission, so his lines all the way to the sea were under his control. On arrival at Aror, Alexander much admired the city and country. It seems he had good reason. The land from Bakr to Sehwan is very fertile, and the region is sometimes called the Garden of Sind. Richard F. Burton, in 1851, wrote, quote, "The heaps of ruins which cover the face of the country, the traces of great and important works, the concurrence of tradition, histories, and travellers in describing its ancient glories are so many proofs that the province was not always what it is now." In his later book, Sind Revisited, 1877, he waxes eloquent about the picturesque setting of the city, a tall, irregular mass of mud walls built upon an eminence of limestone. Sucker Reach, where irrigation is easy, he writes, boasts of beautiful date and garden grounds, with the various items of jamun, ber, pipal, neem, tamarinds and tamarisks, poplars, red-flowered capers, and the pomegranate, all flame and green. He also writes, at this season, early February, Sucker will surprise you by its delightful climate, comparing it to Tuscany, and noting that this pleasant weather will last until the end of March. Well, I'm pleased to be able to test at least these assertions from Burton's book by being here in the right time of year. It seems likely that this is also the time that Alexander arrived, just before the feverish April set in. Maybe this may be part of the reason that Onesicritus, the most philosophical of the lost Alexander historians, found in Musicanus' land a kind of utopia. Strabo reports that he praised it for the longevity of the inhabitants, their healthfulness, and simple diet, even though their country has an abundance of everything. Onesicritus also described a self-grown grain similar to wheat, and vines from which wine is produced, as well as wool-bearing trees, and he went into detail about the banyan. The country abounds in herbs and roots, both curative and poisonous, about which you have also heard this morning. Onesicritus' observations on the society include the following. They have a kind of Laconian common mess where they eat in public and use as food the meat of animals taken in the chase. They make no use of gold or silver, though they have mines. Instead of slaves, they use young men in the vigor of life, as the Cretans use the Aphamiotai and the Laconians the Helots. And they make no accurate study of the sciences except that of medicine, for they regard much training in some of them as wickedness, for example, military science and the like. And they have no process at law except for murder and outrage, for it is not in one's power to avoid suffering these, whereas the content of contracts is in the power of each man himself. The comparisons Onesicritus makes to the customs of Sparta and Crete, both regarded as ideal societies in the Greek world, as well as the longevity of the inhabitants and their justice, have suggested to some scholars that Onesicritus is presenting a portrait of an ideal society which may have little relation to the realities of life in Musica. Their contempt for military science seems at odds with their violent rebellion against their conqueror. The cultivation of vines seems at odds with Brahman prohibitions, though Ctesias, half a century earlier, had also praised the wine from the Indus. The alleged absence of slavery is a historical puzzle. I think I need to skip over what I've written about slavery in comparison with Megasthenes a couple of decades later. Romola Tapar has summed it up very well. Megasthenes may have been confused by the caste status cutting across the economic stratification. Technically, there was no large-scale slavery for production. Greek society made a sharp distinction between the free man and the slave, which distinction was not apparent in Indian society. The suspicion arises, as I said, that both Megasthenes and Onesicritus are making utopias out of these places. The justice of the Indians had become something of a cliché in Greek writing, on which I could refer to a paper I wrote a few years ago. Plato believed it was necessary to create a utopia to ensure a just society, and that justice could only be ensured by extensive and detailed laws. Indian society is described by both Nearchus and Megasthenes as having no written laws. So India was a natural utopia. Indians, like Plato, recognized that society was impossible without a sense of justice. So the Dharma was established at the moment of creation. The power of the Dharma was enshrined in the numerous books of laws, or Dharma Sutras, which began to be written in the early centuries CE, though Romola Tapar makes clear that such codes came in with the rise of kingship in the 6th century BC. A statement in the Chandogya Upanishad, for example, runs, "In my kingdom there are no thieves, no misers, no one who drinks, no one without learning or a sacred fire, no lecher, much less a whore." And in the Mahabharata, I quote, Bhishma said, "Just as a peacock's tail has feathers of many colors, so should a king who knows the laws display many different forms: sharpness, deviousness, indomitability, truthfulness, and rectitude. He should rely upon Brahmins and accomplished ascetics." The interconnection of laws and kingship is also the context for the exchange between the naked philosophers and Alexander in the Alexander romance. The question he asks is, "What is kingship?" And they reply, "Unjust power used to the disadvantage of others, insolence supported by opportunity, a golden burden." I'm going to skip the paragraph about medicine. It's notable that Onesicritus did not, as far as we know, offer comparable descriptions of other Sindhi societies, though he did take an interest in the customs of several other states. He described the kingdom of Kathaya in the Punjab, where kings were elected for their beauty, marriages were made for love, babies were scrutinized to decide whether they should live or die, and people dyed their beards in bright colors. Widow burning was encountered here for the first time by the Greeks. Kathaya is perhaps to be identified with the Katis of Kathiawar. This interesting selection of curious customs hardly adds up to a utopia, though some of the traits may be admirable, and the eugenic approach to newborns would not have disgusted an ancient Greek. Onesicritus was also given the task of interviewing the naked philosophers of Taxila, on which occasion he was able to observe the strict vegetarianism of these ascetics and to tell his interlocutor that the doctrines he purveyed resembled those of Pythagoras. Unfortunately, Strabo's précis hardly makes it possible to discover what the Indian taught or in what respects his beliefs resembled those of Pythagoras. Strabo is annoying me again. Strabo remarks sourly that in Onesicritus lauds the commentary of Musicanus at length for things of which some are reported as common to other Indians. In fact, the things he reports can, as I've shown, mostly been corroborated from Indian sources as well. So some scholars have seen Onesicritus' description of Musicanus' kingdom as an ideal state coloured by the Cynic philosophy, of which the author seems to have been an adherent. Lionel Pearson calls Onesicritus' description a very commonplace type of ideal state, showing the anti-democratic prejudices that are so familiar in Athenian authors of the 5th and 4th centuries. However, the fact is that ideal states have not really become common by this time. Plato's ideal state in the Republic has little in common with the life of ease and gentleness that Onesicritus ascribes to the Musicani, and the golden age of Kronos in Plato's Sophist remains in the realm of myth. What Onesicritus wrote sowed the seeds for a later vigorous development of the genre in the works of Theopompus, Iambulus, and Euhemerus. They all used a loosely imagined India as the setting for a golden lands that flowed with milk and honey. Indian sources, too, are familiar with the idea of a golden land. Their Uttarakuru corresponds to the Hyperborea of the Greeks. This is not what Onesicritus presented. In short, he was doing his best to report on the peculiarities of the societies he encountered. It's much to be regretted that all we have of his work is what Strabo chose to excerpt or paraphrase, and that Strabo so often lost patience with his sources and found contradiction where there was none. We should not add to Strabo's distrustful attitude the assumption that Onesicritus was writing to express his own philosophical standpoint. If he had, surely he would have been more systematic than the assortment of facts that Strabo derived from his work. My last section is called Historical Reality. Can we use Onesicritus' account of the kingdom of Musicanus to construct a historical picture of the state? We don't have enough material in Strabo, and I point out that the same lack is evident in his account of the naked philosophers of Taxila. I think that Strabo was often unskilled in making a précis of what he read. We do not know how Onesicritus acquired his information about the kingdom of Musicanus and whether he conversed with wise men or leading figures in the kingdom. Even if he relied solely on what he could observe by looking around him, it's obvious that his description lacks many topics that an ethnologist would home in on: religion, women, diet, commerce, the arts, for example, all of which are topics that Megasthenes also admits in his description of Maurya India, if it's not Strabo who passes over them. Viniarchik quotes with approval a remark of another scholar that one can be by no means certain that the land of Musicanus was actually a kingdom. Skepticism going full tilt again. Can we be certain even of so much? It's true that the name is an ethnonym. As in many other places, Greek writers apply the ethnonym to the perceived leading man of the state. We can seek some context by considering the different kinds of state for which we have evidence in India of the 4th century BCE. Upinder Singh, in a valuable discussion of the rise of states from 600 to 300 BC, shows that in the late Vedic period, there was a transition from tribal politics based on lineage to territorial states. These could take various forms. There were 16 Mahajanapadas, or large settled regions, mostly in the Ganges Valley, and the region northwards to the mountains and southwards to Ujjain. These included not only kingdoms, rajas, but Ganas and Sanghas, which were republics with a ruling oligarchy, often clan-based. In the Indus region, Panini's 4th century Astadhyayi mentions several Ganas, including the Kshudrakas and Malavas, the Oxydrakai and Malloy in Greek, as well as the Shibis and the Ambastas. The rise of kingship involves the concentration of political power in a single individual and is thus an extreme form of clan-based power, supported by the concentration of land ownership, in which strategic marriages would commonly play a part. Warfare was also a factor in the consolidation of a king's power, as the Vedic battle leader becomes also a protector of his people, especially Brahmans. He's a custodian of the social order. This can also be expressed as the transition from the dominance of Rata to Dharma. The rhetoric or ideology of a kingdom thus involves an emphasis on the rule of law. This fits very well for what Onesicritus tells us of Musicanus. Later, both the laws of Manu and the Arthashastra of Kautilya emphasize the role of the king as protector of his people. In these texts, the sacral role of the king that is so prominent in the Vedas is entirely laid aside. Dare we interpret the kingdom of Musicanus as one in which religious duties were so attenuated that Onesicritus had no occasion to observe them. Singh also draws attention to the close relationship of kings with Brahmans, who are under their especial protection. This is consonant with the information in Aryan that the Brahmans of the Brahman city had instigated the revolt of Musicanus, and also with the statement of Megasthenes a decade or two later that the Brahmans, in his case in Magadha, in the Maurya kingdom, are advisors to the king. He refers both to the philosophers who are used by those who make sacrifices to the gods or offerings to the dead, these have to be Brahmans, and to the advisors and counselors of the king, in whose hands are the chief offices of state, the courts and administration of everything, and these need not be Brahmans. Thus, everything we learn from Onesicritus and the other historians is consistent with Musicanus' state being an early example of a new-style Indian kingdom, with an emphasis on law. Onesicritus' report is reliable as far as it goes, but cannot be regarded as a systematic portrait of the kingdom. We must remember that while Onesicritus was interested in the way people lived in India, Alexander probably was not. His strategic aims overrode his philosophical interests, and Musicanus and his people could only end up as victims. Paethon retained his satrapy after the death of Alexander, and according to Justin, he and the other eastern satraps made a good thing of their opportunities, turning their provinces into virtual kingdoms. How long such kingly power continued, our historical sources do not tell us. Within a short time after Alexander's departure, many Indian states reverted to native rule, and a new power in the north, Chandragupta's Maurya kingdom, was establishing a native empire over a large part of India. The story of the kingdom of the Musika falls silent until it re-emerges under its new name of Alor in the 9th century CE. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Stoneman, for a very fascinating presentation on the kingdom of Musicanus that flourished on the left bank of Indus, today what is known as Rodi. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk and educating us on some of the very interesting facts that was not known to us. So our next speaker is Dr. Rachel Myers. Dr. Rachel Myers is Professor of Classics and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Reading, United Kingdom. She received her PhD from University of Cambridge and has previously held positions at New York University, the University of Oxford and Brown University. Her research includes multilingualism and cultural interaction in the ancient world, especially Egypt and Central Asia and the 19th century Middle East. Some of her books include The Hellenistic Far East, Archaeology, Language and Identity in Greek Central Asia. Her most recent book is the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek world. The topic of her presentation is Legacies of Alexander in Colonial Sin. Dr. Rachel Myers.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, can you hear me? Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the hospitality that we've been shown during our time here in Karachi. This is my first time in Pakistan. I've wanted to have the opportunity to visit here for many years, so it's a real delight and an honour to be here with you today. And I'm really touched and honoured by the hospitality, the generosity, and the excellent food and company which we've been shown while we've been here. So thank you. Just while we're setting the PowerPoint up, let me say something possibly controversial for this audience, which is that I'm sceptical about hero worship. I think hero worship can sometimes be a positive thing. Sometimes we can find good role models in people from the past. But sometimes hero worship can be an uncritical thing which leads people down dangerous paths. Alexander is obviously one of the people I'm thinking about, but the other I'm thinking about is the person with whom I'm going to begin my presentation today. Can we get this up on the big screen as well, or is it great? I'll pause for a moment and let you wonder who I'm talking about. Ah, excellent, thank you very much. Richard Francis Burton is a name that's already been mentioned today by Richard, and a name that some of you may be very well familiar with already. He was a controversial traveller, scholar, Orientalist, soldier, well known for at least two quite scandalous works that he wrote about Karachi, one of which survives and one does not. And he became famous later in the 19th century, after his time in Sindh, for his journey to Mecca in disguise as a Muslim pilgrim. But before his famed later journeys, he spent some time in Sindh as a very young man in the East India Company Army, and he visited Sewan in December of 1845, a visit about which we've already heard a little. Shortly after his visit to Sewan, Burton contracted cholera. He was very unwell, and he was granted a period of 6 months convalescence of rest leave, during which he travelled in Goa. And in his book about Goa, he wrote about something that had happened at Sewan when he was there some months earlier. Antiquarians are everywhere a simple race. He's very dismissive of archaeologists and historians here. In India, speaking with all due respect, we're almost tempted to describe them as simpletons. I think many of us here would take offence at that description. Who does not recollect the Athenaeum sauce jar which some wag buried in the ruins of a fort, said to have been founded by Alexander the Great at Sewan and Sindh, and the strange theories which the Etruscan images upon that article elicited from grave and learned heads? Well, for those of us who are not living in the 1840s, this perhaps requires a little explanation. What Burton is saying happened is that somebody took a jar used to contain a special kind of sauce, which was produced by the company of Cross and Blackwell in England. And Cross and Blackwell had a gimmick whereby they produced jars for their sauces and chutneys, which had images of ancient designs in them. And this particular sauce jar had ancient Etruscan images, which could potentially, to the unlearned, pass as an ancient Greek jar. So somebody, he says, buried this at Sewan so that somebody, a would-be archaeologist, would find it and think they'd mistakenly found traces of Alexander. Well, as it turns out, Burton was the one who pulled this prank himself, and we know this because many years later, when he wrote again about his early residence in Sindh, he confessed completely to what he had done. Many years ago, in my hot youth, a credulous antiquary was digging here at Sewan and finding all manner of proof that he was at the headquarters of Alexander's host. In those days, we effected a now obsolete article called the Athenaeum sauce, and it came to us in a manner of pot rudely imitated from a painted Etruscan vase. How thoughtless and reckless is man before the age of 25? Well, this is ridiculous because Burton continued to be reckless well into middle and old age. To smash that pot, to treat it with fire and acid, and to bury it in the ground on the line taken by the excavator was the work of an idle day. And it was duly unearthed, washed, carried home, and presently shown to a number of wondering friends as proof positive that the Rasenna had their original homes in Sindh. But Burton confessed to what he had done, and the archaeologist who unearthed his sauce jar was disappointed to find that he had not found evidence of Alexander at Sewan. What I'd like to talk to you about today is not this specific incident, which I've used as a jumping off point, But the wider question of why Burton would have planted a fake ancient jar at Sewan, how and why the story of Sewang's association with Alexander spread in the 19th century, in particular after the British invasion of Sindh, and then I'll come back to the question of whether Burton was right or wrong to be sceptical of this association between Alexander the Great and Sewan. But let's come back to his description of his visit to the site as well. And it should be noted that Burton had, for the period, a very typically Orientalist, condescending attitude to the place and the people that he encountered when he was here. And in the passage that I have on the slide here, in particular, he's very sceptical about the association with Alexander, because he says that whenever a tourist visits a ruin anywhere in the world and asks somebody who built it, who it's associated with, they will often get a quite formulaic answer. And he thinks that the association with Alexander the Great is of this nature. He thinks it's nothing more than a story that's told to tourists. And his reason for arguing that the association with Alexander is not accurate at Sewan is something that I'll come back to. He says, "This man cannot be of Grecian origin, I humbly opine, for two reasons. The arches are Asiatic, and the broken bits of man's handiwork found scattered about in its entrails are Oriental." And he goes on in that ilk. He makes a further allegation, which is that he believes that the association with Alexander only came about because of British interest in the figure of Alexander the Great and their recent arrival in Sewan and Sindh, something which I will come back to. So to sum up, Burton, in his writings about Sindh and about Sewan, alleges that the association with Alexander was invented, that it was relatively recent, that it was encouraged by the British obsession with Alexander the Great in his route. Should we believe him or not? I'll come back to this. And most importantly, we should recall that Burton is writing at a period only a few years after Sindh's annexation by Napier, when he made when somebody on his behalf made the famous joke, "Peccavi," Latin for "I have sinned," and that he was writing largely for an audience of British soldiers and officials who were tasked specifically with consolidating British control and exploitation there. So this is the audience for whom he's writing. Now, when I talk about the obsession with Alexander the Great of the British in the Indian subcontinent, in Sindh and other places as well, this is something that can be very well substantiated in the writings of members of the East India Company and others who were in what's now Pakistan and India and other regions of South Asia at that time. So, for example, we could look at the remarks of Henry Pottinger of the East India Company, writing as early as 1816, writing specifically here again about Sewan, and he is fixated on the Macedonian, as he refers to Alexander here, and says, "I have no scruple in saying that it must have been at the present Sewan, that fortress being seated on a high hill that overlooks the ferries across the Indus and Larkanu rivers, and otherwise admirably situated to all the surrounding tracts." Well, what basis do people like Pottinger have for making this claim? Well, first of all, we know that these men were very well read in the ancient Greek and Roman historians of Alexander. They were literally coming to Sindh with copies of these books in their baggage and reading them as they travelled about the countryside, reflecting on the routes. And very often, unfortunately, we find that East India Company members were more reliant and more inclined to trust the works of ancient Greek and Roman historians than they were inclined to listen to and trust the testimony of the many people that they met along the way. Moving on further into the 1800s, we see people like Keith Jackson here, who is famous for his illustrations of Sindh, talking again about Sewan, saying that it no doubt existed before the invasion by Alexander the Macedonian, but he's also talking about this as being a site that he associates quite strongly with the figure of Alexander. More examples of this. You can simply read through the account of any British soldier or traveller in Sindh in the 19th century, look for Sewan, and you will find that they talk about Alexander the Great as well. Edward Backhouse Eastwick in 1849, this is after the annexation of Sindh, refers to Alexander as Macedonia's madman. He's not a huge fan of Alexander here as well. And he is slightly different in talking about not just the old ruins of what is said to have been a castle built by Alexander, but to bring a voice of skepticism into this as well. He says, the truth is one can make nothing of Arrian's account of Sindh, and it's probable that the whole course of the river is altogether changed since the days of Macedonia's madman. This account is unusual because he's one of the few people who actually comments on changes to the hydrography of the river which may have affected the ability of us to reconstruct historical geography. More and more examples of these. We could simply go on. I'm just giving a few numbers here. Thomas Postings in 1843, talking about the possible origin of the fortification at Sewan in Alexander's expedition. But let me relate these accounts more directly to political and military circumstances in the 1840s. So if we recall, Richard Burton was at Sewan in late 1845. That's when he's writing. But in 1843, General Sir Charles Napier, the British invader of Sindh, in 1844, is writing his own account of the military campaign and expedition here. And if you read through this, there are constant references to Alexander the Great. Like most of these British military invading figures, they're obsessed with an invader of 2,000 plus years earlier in the same territory. And Napier was looking forward very much to visiting Sewan, especially because of the association with Alexander. So he writes on the eve of his visit, "Tomorrow I shall reach Sewan where Alexander built his tower, and I shall stand where he stood, as indeed I have before, but not on the known spot." So he's very keen on this. But ironically, he ends up being slightly disappointed when he actually gets there. And although he's not a trained archaeologist, he's not somebody who is well up in antiquities, he's not able to comment knowledgeably on the site, it spurs him on to further reflections about Alexander's fate and his own probable fate. It may be difficult to see at the bottom of the slide here, but just let me read it. He says, "It is better that life should go sliding away and then a sudden drop, but while it lasts, let me be in harness and die with my sword by my side like a gentleman, if in victory so best." Now, this is an oblique reference to Alexander the Great, who, of course, notoriously died not in battle, but in his own bed of a fever. And Napier is hoping that he does not have this fate himself. So we've established then in the mid-19th century a British fixation on Alexander the Great in Sindh, a desire to see him in places, and a particular tendency to comment on Sewan as being a likely spot to be associated either with the ancient Sindhamana or with another place where Alexander stopped on his way along the Indus. But when we come into archaeological investigations, people who have a proper scientific training in archaeology and cultural heritage, we find that it takes quite a long time for people to really begin to critically question the nature of the historical background of the settlement at Sewan, the association with Alexander, and whether in fact Alexander is the correct person to be focusing on here at all. In 1871, Alexander Cunningham of the Archaeological Survey of India visited Sewan. He did not conduct excavations there, but he did visit the site. And he notes that it is clearly a site of great antiquity as well. And he says in passing, without fully investigating it, that he agrees with the identification of Sewan with the Sindhamana of the classical sources. Later on, more archaeologists, both British, Pakistani, Indian, under the Raj as well, investigated the site and critiqued the identification with Alexander. So Henry Cousins of the Archaeological Survey of India in the 1920s reports the connection, it is indeed said to date back to Alexander the Great, but he also points out that nothing has been found in the form of undeniably Greek-looking artefacts at the site. And if you'll note, he refers back to Burton's earlier prank in the 1840s of faking a Greek artefact at Sewan. As we come further into the 20th century, we see people moving away from reporting the hearsay of Alexander about Sewan towards a greater interest in the site as a whole, its longer history and the things that we can draw out of that. Salim Ali of the Bombay Natural Historical Society wrote about the site in the 1920s as well. He claims that there's only an abstruse connection with Alexander, but he's also interested in pointing out the modern religious and devotional associations of the site, which I think we're going to hear more about tomorrow as well. Manek Pitawala in the 1930s says that it's the only Greek city relic in Sindh today, but did not have the opportunity to investigate it further. And then by the time we come into the 1930s, N.G. Majumdar of the Archaeological Survey of India, who tragically was killed by bandits just 50 kilometres from Sewan in 1938, talks about the identification accepted by Cunningham many years earlier, but he has the opportunity to do a more thorough archaeological inspection of the site, where he looks at the glazed pottery, the bricks, and points out that this is a site that we really only do justice to if we explore the longer-term archaeological history. We begin to see a focus here more holistically on the site as being something that one must appreciate in the longue durée, rather than looking at the relatively brief stay of a single conqueror some 2,000 years earlier. But let me finish up by looking at the question of whether the scepticism cited by Burton and by others about Alexander's presence at Sewan is in fact justified. Well, fundamentally, all of the accounts that I've just cited tell us only that no evidence has yet been uncovered of Alexander's presence at Sewan. They don't present they present no evidence that he was not there. This is the old cliche that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And if we look at Burton's reasoning for why Sewan cannot be a fort of Alexander, we find that his reasoning on modern archaeological grounds is faulty. So to return to what he said, the mound cannot be of Grecian origin, the arches are Asiatic, and the broken bits of man's handiwork found scattered around in its entrails are Oriental. Well, what Burton's saying here is that the archaeological style and the artistic style of things at the site does not look Greek. But this is faulty reasoning, as I'll go on to discuss. And we can look at other archaeological sites in Pakistan and Afghanistan and elsewhere in Central Asia to show why this reasoning is not correct. We're very fortunate that we do have the excavated archaeological remains of a number of sites, through which Alexander passed or which were the centres of Hellenistic kingdoms, Greek-ruled states in the period immediately after Alexander. So we can say something about what such a site looks like archaeologically, what its architectural remains look like, what kinds of artefacts one recovers from it. The most famous of these settlements is Ai-Khanum in northern Afghanistan, the ancient region of Bactria, which was an area campaigned through by Alexander, but also which became the centre of a Greco-Bactrian kingdom in the period after Alexander. Now, the most notorious or most famous thing about this site at Ai-Khanum is that although it was a Greek city, which I'll put in scare quotes, the complexity and diversity of the forms of material remains which come from this are very, very different from what we would expect to excavate in Greece, in Athens or Pella, or anywhere in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean. It's a place which has items such as Corinthian capitals, which look very Greek, but it also has items which show its very close affinities and dissociation both with northern Central Asia and with the Indian subcontinent, with the Indus Valley and places south of the Hindu Kush as well. We find items such as the circular item on the slide, which is an ivory plaque depicting scenes from Indian mythology. So when we do find remains of places that were campaigned through by Alexander or were sites of Greek settlement, they don't look like what people in the 19th century expected them to look like. So to conclude, we have to ask ourselves, what would the material remains of the presence of Alexander and his army look like at Sehwan? What would we expect to see if we find Alexander at this site? And let me reiterate very strongly that the only thing that can tell us more about Sehwan at this point, I think, other than investigation of sources, which we're all engaged with here, is further archaeological investigation at the site. That's the really exciting thing that we have to look forward to, what archaeologically this site of great promise will yield in the future. Sites like Ai-Khanum and also places within Pakistan like Barakot and also Charsada and Taxila can help us understand a little bit what we are looking for when we want to find whether Alexander passed by a certain place. We might look for damage to defences, we might look at rebuildings of walls and defences. But I can say with reasonable certainty that unlike Berting's expectation, what we should not expect to find is a painted Greek vase. Thank you very much for your attention. Shukriya.
Thank you, Dr. Myers, for a wonderful talk on colonial legacies in Sindh. So now we have the last speaker of this third session of Alexander in Sindh accounts, historical accounts. The last speaker is Dr. Zainul Wahab. Dr. Zainul Wahab holds the position of chairman in the Department of Conservation Studies, Hazara University, Mansra. Dr. Wahab completed his MA in archaeology from University of Peshawar in 1984. He completed his PhD in 2004 from University of Ioannina, Greece. He also completed 2 projects during his postdoctoral stay in Greece. He also has authored a few books and several articles on the same subjects, which is archaeology and conservation. He is one of the best Greek and classical Buddhist experts, Buddhist art experts in the country. He is an eminent archaeologist and was nominated for the highest national award, Sitaira Imtiaz, for protection of 2,200 Buddhist sculptures during the Taliban era in the region. So please welcome Dr. Zainul Wahab. The topic of his presentation is Alexander the Great in current Pakistan, an empire or a general. Dr. Wahab.
इससे आगे जाएगी, इससे पीछे आएगी, इससे आगे बढ़ती रहिएगा। ठीक है।
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. I would like to congratulate all the organizers of this conference, particularly Mr. Abdul Hamid Dahoon and his team. I also congratulate to the Endowment Fund Trust of Sindh to help out this conference. The conference will give a fruitful result in future. This will help in promote world tourism, protecting culture, and spreading awareness. Local and international heroes will be recognized. This is journal map. First of all, the reason of Alexander campaign. Before studying his route, let's discuss why Alexander invaded the land to expand his empire or campaign. Some scholars of the history have suggested that it was his adventure, personality, and ambition that led him to his conquest, while other scholars believe that he wanted to surpass the mythical exploit of the Greek god, meaning that he did not want to religious shackle binding him to Greece, even though he was considered to be a descendant of Heracles, who was the son of Zeus. It is also said that Alexander worshipped Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. Some of the scholars also say that this campaign might as well be revenge from the Persian and allies who defeated the Greek in 480 BC under the leadership of Xerxes. All these people included in the army of the Xerxes. The first Greek expedition to the Indus Valley focused on surveying the river Indus. The Greek came to the contact with the people of this area for the first time in the reign of Achaemenid Emperor Darius. Darius sent the Skylax of the Corinda to explore the entire river Indus. Skylax started his expedition from the city of Kaspati near the Navshera district and sailed down the river Indus and discovered the place where it entered the sea. The second contact was more vigorous and left a more durable effect. It was Alexander's military campaign in 326 BC. The third campaign not invaded the central Sindh. They were only ruled in Gandhara and finally reached to Bharat. Alexander's Indian campaign started from Nicaea, but some people says the Nike and Nicaea is different words. Nike is the goddess of victory, and Nicaea a beautiful place near the present Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan. As a tactical approach, he divided his army into two groups, from which one was led by two of his generals, Hephaestion and Perdiccas, who were ordered to follow the shortest route to India River and meet with him on the other side. The division reached its goal without any serious problem. Alexander took the other groups under his own command. The group took the river difficulty. Alexander took the other groups under his own command. The group took the more difficult routes, which was to throw and hilly alongside the present river Kunal called Chagasre, the near Afghanistan, which I personally visit so many times. But fortunately, I kidnapped for 1 week. But still, with the help of the other people, I released. From the hilly Kunal Valley, Alexander had to cross a mountain to reach Arigum, and which is the Bajawad, and not Parklang, the Nava Pass. Nava Pass is the only important route that goes from Kunal to Bajawad. The Argamina is also known as Nawagai. Nawagai is the place of the consist of many ancient sites, hilly slope. The local people called Ut. Nawagai is locally known as Ali Nagar or Ari Nagar. We can see close resemblance between the Ali Nagar and Arigom is he could turn, the Alexander could turn east and take longer but well frequent road through the fertile valley of Panchkoda, Swat. Alexander had now entered the territory of the Asawakis, whose chief city were Masaga, Bazira and Ora. Therefore, the Stein attempt to identify the sites of these cities in Swat rather than Peshawar Valley. Masaga was the first stronghold at the Alexander way. Masaga is Sanskrit, is stated as Masaka. In the Garamin of Panini, a native of Gandhara, in which is the Asakinis were comprised, the word Masakawati occur at the name of the river and district unknown. After the defeat of Masaga, Alexander Great Ura and Odigram, Barikot, and ancient Ura and Bazira reached to invaded. They were defeated, invaded these cities. Before this, I personally excavated this site on the way up Alexander. That we are started excavation 2003 and found beautiful sculpture have a deep Greek influence and silver relic casket which is prove the roots of Alexander the Great after Alexander the Great in that area. After the Ora and Bazira, the many people are the Avarnos, and he reached to Avarnos. Many people of the opinion that Avarnos is near the Takot. Me and Dr. Separamandar agreed that it is located in Buner called Ilam. Ilos in the Greek words, according to me, to my and Dr. Seporaman Dar work shows, it was the area of the Low Elam, the Big Elam, where the local population took shelter. Alexander himself, with the same of his journal, visited this site before the attack. This area is also associated with the Sikh and Hinduism still continue. This is the rock carving of different in Avarnos nowadays called Elam. The two armies reunited at Han Sawabi, which was the third capital of Gandhara now from their march towards Tiksala. As the approach of Raja Ambi, the ruler of Tiksala, welcomed to Alexander with gifts and aids at the surrender, as a surrender. He had included 500 elephants and other things. The government of KP erected a building of Alexander Monument. After the Hunt, the Alexander army crossed the river and reached Tiksala. The Greeks are thought to have stayed in Beer Mound. We can see the remains. This is the first historic city of Tiksala, having led by the Persian and occupied until to sometimes from Tixala, Alexander proceeded towards Jhelum. Fight with the Raja Porus. The battle of the Hydaspes was fight between the Alexander the Great and Porus in May 325 or 324. It took place the bank of the Hydaspes River in Punjab, a part of Alexander Indian campaign. In what was the possible, there the mostly costly engagement of Macedonian army, secured and decisive victory over the Purnas and captured Porus. Large area of Punjab were subsequently absorbed into the Macedonian Empire. Porus was reinstated. Little bit I explain here the Tixala. The Panini words is actually the Tixala have a university in 450 BC. The first vice chancellor of that university was called Panini, and Panini wrote a book, Ashte Dihai, 8 chapters, and he was the best grammarian of the Sanskrit. From the Alexander campaign, sin began. Let's discuss the reason that led him to take sin as his next objective. Reason of the sin campaign, from here Alexander conquers, invaded, the sin began. Let's discuss the reason that him to take sin. Sorry, this is the second time. The first reason would be prolonged relation between the Greek and since Bronze Age. Indus beads were a type of necklaces made by the Indus civilization. Those beads necklaces have been found in Crete island, which comes with the area of the Greece. They proves as a symbol of trade between the Greece and Sindh. The Indus civilization is considered as one of the very first and largest civilization of the world, encompassing the surprisingly vast area of the present Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. The cultural boundary of the Sindh reached to different the whole subcontinent. A major, another thing I bring to your kind notice, that time the Mohenjo-daro is the world first city is Uruk, near between the Dajla, the Euphrates and Tigris. There's the second city is Uruk, and the third city is Mohenjo-daro. It is a great honor for Sindh. A major reason of the Sindh, a major reason to the invaded Sindh was that it was the major center of the Indus civilization because it had the most developed and sophisticated urban areas at that time, such as Mohenjo-daro and other near about the sites, which still available in different places, remains of that sites. The Indus people were also known for their war weapons. This was probably also as opportunity to increase his military strength further. Just as I said, note, it was in Sindh the Alexander was struck by the poisonous arrows in Multan area near to the border of Sindh. Multan was the part of Sindh culturally the Multan was the part of the Sindh at that time. Alexander moved towards Sugdia, presently known as Soga Raja, from Multan. His campaign of present Sindh truly began. He also built a fortified city between the Rahim Yar Khan and Sakar, where he stayed for a few days and repaired his boats and other activities. The traces of the city have been found from Patna Minara, which is in the ancient tower. According to the Aryan ruler of Aror, according to the Aryan, the rule of Arol, namely Musikanos, came. Now the professor already discussed these things. Though to come to Soga Raja, we will come to Alexander with the gift and as surrender. As well, Alexander later he visited, stay and few days in Arol. After the staying a few days, Arol Alexander took linking to this city because of its greenery, fountain, and pleasant environment, and later he handed over to the city to Musakanos and proceeded further on his western bank of the Indus and past the present Shikarpur. The Greek army led by Alexander then reached to present Ladkana and defeated their ruler Aksakanos. Mahota is another city said that have been captured by Alexander. All the rulers, those city in Alexander way, accepted him without any resistance except for the Sambo. Sambo is the most important and tactful Raja of this area. This included in the city like Rudi and the eastern side of the Indus River as well. Area of the Sindhomana and around were captured and he processed it towards the Patala in July 324 BC. We have some picture and few sites here. One shows the remains of the Sadomana and Sehwan Sharif. We quickly finish, don't worry about that. Bismillah. The impact of the Greek campaign in Pakistan. Moving forward as well as discussing the Greek impact, his campaign left following his route to Sindh. As we know, some of the world great historians such as Aryans were from the Greece. The Greek impact would be that the history of this land had been recorded. The campaign brought the culture passion. It focused the culture, language, literature, and other related things. The impact of the Greek on the local people. It was the result of the culture passion that Buddhist art began in the region as well. The proper kinds were introduced here from the first time. Cities like Sarkap, Shekhandiri, and other places. Impact of the Greek campaign in Pakistan and other things is the art. The effect of the Greek culture can be most visible, be seen on the art, architecture in present Pakistan and mainly Sindh. For example, the tile tray and meaning the tile tray, the trays, the people kept toothbrushes and saucer on and other important the people sitting there, and also there's some architecture design like some temples and Corinthian pillar, another type of pillars also introduced by the Greek in this area. But thank you very much for your patience, but unfortunately we have a little problem. So anyhow, if I have some mistakes, so sorry for that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah, for a wonderful presentation. Now I would like to request all the speakers of this session to please come and take seats on the stage so that we can start taking questions from the audience. Please. I would appreciate if you kindly, we would just take few questions, and I would appreciate if you first introduce and ask questions, and we would discourage the comments. So I would appreciate if you just ask the questions. So are there any questions? Are there any questions from any? Yes.
Hello. Yes, I'm Nusrat Khwaja, and what I have guessed from the talks is that there are not too many traces of Alexander through Sindh. So can we assume that they never meant to settle, but it was just a military campaign if he moved through? Dr. Rachel Myers.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. In terms of the archaeological remains, I myself haven't excavated in Sindh. I can only be reliant on reading the archaeological work of others, and there are no, to my knowledge, specific traces of his campaign in the archaeological record. That does not mean that they're not there to be found, of course, but I think it's certainly correct that if we did find traces of his passing through, it would be of the nature of sort of fortifications, garrisoning. He was not really settling a large number of people here. It wasn't colonization. It was invasion rather than that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Jafar, is this?
Thank you very much. I was very impressed by your paper about the colonial officers' interest in Alexander. I would like to know, was it individual interest of certain officers, or was there any policy, or was there any colonial policy to look back at the past of Sindh, and particularly the period when Alexander was here?
I think most British members of the East India Company Army or later colonial officials were educated from childhood to be fascinated with Alexander the Great and ancient Greek and Roman history. So when they came to Sindh and to Pakistan, now Pakistan, they were viewing this country through the lens of ancient Greek and Roman historians whom they had been reading since childhood. So I don't think there was any need as such for an official policy of interest in association with this. It was so deep-rooted in the very way in which people had grown up from childhood. I think it contributed towards the nature of British colonialism and imperialism here, because there can be no doubt that the British very deeply identified with Alexander the Greeks. They thought they were the ancient Greeks coming to this region again, and I think we can see the mark of that very clearly.
Dr. Nilofer. Dr. Nilofer. Yeah.
It's on Nilofer. I'm Nilofer. Your paper was very interesting, Dr. Myers. Sorry, your paper was very interesting in that you mentioned the archaeological evidences also in the northern area. Here in Sindh, as you said, we have not yet encountered a single sherd or a coin anywhere. So how do we see Alexander's presence here? Because I have been exploring the whole of Sindh. I have been excavating at some of the sites even. I have not encountered. I have worked on sites from Paleolithic to the present times. Not a single sherd or anything represents Alexander's presence in Sindh. How do we see that?
Very interesting.
I'll be honest, in my view, I don't think we will see his presence in the archaeological record. I think the only thing one could argue it from would be, for example, if there were securely dated strata of the late 4th century BC where we see evidence of destruction and rebuilding of fortifications. But that would be something that one would need to argue tangentially based on that. I think there can be no firm confirmation of it at all.
We need to do something in this direction because we need to excavate with a multidisciplinary team on these sites where historically they say there was presence of Alexander. So this is the only solution which I can see in future if excavation at Sewar, at Mansoura, or proper excavation at Bambor and other sites we may encounter in future, but so far not a single thing has been found.
I think it would be wonderful to see those kind of archaeological projects happen in the near future, but I think the most valuable thing that would come out of it would be illuminating the longer, rich history of Sindh rather than focusing specifically on Alexander. So I think we're in agreement probably.
Yes, I agree what Dr. Nilofer said, that nothing has been found from Sindh as far as archaeological evidence is concerned. But Alexander or Sikandar, as we know him, this part of the world is preserved in the oral tradition. So we don't have anything. You're right, Dr. Nilofer. Yes, any other question? Aziz?
I have it.
Yes, please. Mike.
My question again revolves around the fact that what you have quoted from British sources all negate Alexander's presence here. But why did the British consider it necessary, or why did Burton, the master faker, had to bury something there at Sewan and then say that Alexander was here? This is my first question. The other question is that most of the sites in Sindh have not been excavated. So we can't really get into this. The third point that comes to me as a layman was that he was on the retreat when he was going back. He was unwell, he was on the retreat, and I believe, this is my understanding, I may be wrong, that psychologically he was damaged. His love and passion that he had for his soldiers had rebounded and had hit him hard. And he was then not the Alexander that we read about in books. He was an Alexander who was probably looking into himself again, what has happened. So for him to have expected to go into these details, I think is not fair. And also that at that time his focus was to leave some ration and water for Nearchus to come out and get out of this Indus River, which they had not actually fathomed as to how it would behave. So from what we have had in these findings, I'm sorry I'm dragging on like an old man, but let me bind it up, that Alexander did not park anywhere in Sindh, and that Sewan is probably a myth, and it has nothing to do with Alexander. What do you have to say? Dr. Richard. Yeah.
Please take mic. Please get the mic.
I've already forgotten the... Yes. That's better? Yes. I've already forgotten the first question. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the first question very briefly?
I dragged it so much I've forgotten.
Thank you for that.
My question was that what was the need of Alexander to be doing such a thing, and why did the British consider it important to mention Alexander? One, they had come in here in a dubious manner. They had tricked the Meers into taking over Sindh, for which they are even today they are blamed for that. But what was the need for the Britishers, all of them, Boston, Alexander, Cunningham, to say that yes, he was there, yes, he was not there, no, he was not there, he was not there? And why would Alexander play that vase trick on us, bury it there at Sevan? And that was my
Well, I
first
think
question.
I would concur with what my colleague has said about the state of British education in the 19th century. Everyone was brought up to reading these classical accounts of Thucydides, Xenophon and Arrian, and they regarded themselves as following in the footsteps of Alexander. So there was they identified themselves with the Greek cause, with the Greeks themselves. They thought the British were much like Greeks and were going to do the same kind of thing. But you also made a point, I think, about Alexander not being himself by this stage of the expedition, and that, I think, is quite an interesting point, because it's clear that the wound he suffered at the Mali town was very severe. The sources are not terribly clear, but Ptolemy seems to tell us that when the spear was withdrawn from his side, where it had gone in, blood and water came out together, blood and air came out together, which might suggest a punctured lung, which would be a very serious injury indeed, and it would be quite remarkable for him to have recovered in the 7 days that we're told he had for convalescence. So I feel sure that as the journey down the Indus continued, Alexander was slowly recovering, and because of the other, well, it was not the only time he was wounded. This was the severest wound, but he had also suffered emotional trauma as a result of the death of Hephaestion, and he was not in a good way by the time the army reached Babylon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, any other question?
My name is Munis Ayaz. My question to Dr. Richard. You earlierly elaborated very much about the Mosikanas, the Alor, what we call, and the other place was the Oskana, which is known as Mohata or Larkana nowadays, the place. This I'm referring from the H.T. Lambrick's second volume, who has written 7 volumes on the history of sin. In the second volume, he has mentioned in the chapter the invasion of Alexander. My point is that he has mentioned that he sent an envoy from Mosikanas to Oskana's Raja to pay tribute or surrender or ready for fight. But the other thing is that he reported back to the Alexander that he found the gold as toys, which is mentioned in the footnote on this, in that chapter by Arrian's book of histories, 1 or 2 or 3, I don't remember, but that they have so much gold that either they have, like toys, either they don't have the sense of the gold in their house, or places they used to reside. And the other thing is that they considered the war as an evil, and they were not having much weapons, or they were not didn't see any weapons or anything. So, what do you? Can you please elaborate on that?
Well, as I said, the amount of information that we're given by Onesicratus via Strabo is so small and patchy that it's really very difficult to interpret some of it. In the interests of brevity, I left out some of my comments on these statements about, for example, the presence of gold and silver mines, and it was unclear to me from what the Greek author says whether this simply means that they did not use coinage or of any kind, or whether they never bothered to do anything with the gold and silver, and whether they made vessels or anything like that. And until I get there tomorrow, I don't think I know enough about Sehwan and the related places to know what the archaeology has to show us. So I have come here to learn as much as to instruct about what it to learn and try to understand more clearly what it is that Onesicratus is telling us. Also, this matter of the opposition to warfare is difficult to square with the fact that the kingdom of Musicanus revolted against Alexander and came to a very violent end. Does that answer the points that you are making?
Am I allowed to put in another question, please?
Yes, sir, please.
As my wife's friend Ejaz yesterday put his last question, if Alexander were to come back, what would you ask him? May I ask you, from what the evidence that has been presented today in this particular session, do you think Alexander camped anywhere in Sindh?
He said...
I have asked the question from the panelists. I'll come back to you
first,
if I need to.
Answer, yeah. First answer the question.
Your question is whether we should believe that Alexander actually came to Sindh.
Not to should believe, but whether you believe.
Your perspective.
I have to believe it. I'm a classicist. I have a lot of Greek texts, all of which told me that he came here. I have nothing else to go on.
Okay, so now let's take the last question. Yeah, please. Okay, if there is no... okay, please. Please speak a little louder so can hear you. Mic change.
A real audibility problem here.
Thank you.
The question I wanted to ask you, all three of you panelists, were, you've cast doubts upon the fact that Alexander might have been in Pakistan at all. From all the writings and all the classical writings, we are told that he was here. We certainly have accounts, and these are very detailed accounts, that Niarchos actually had his ships along the Makran coast, keeping track of Alexander's trip through Makran to Gerdosia and onwards. I'm leaving out a lot of the names to make it clear. Now, if we have these accounts, we have the accounts of his coming down as far as Patala, why must we then doubt the fact that he was here?
Well, thank you for your support. I believe he was here because I read it in a book. Rachel.
I think that... I think that there's no doubt he was here in Pakistan, he was here in Sindh, otherwise we've all built our careers on a lie. The thing that I personally have academic scepticism over is whether we can precisely locate him in individual places. I prefer to think of the bigger picture rather than the specific details, but that's my personal prejudice.
Okay, so let me, I think we are running short of time. Can we take one more question?
So, shall we say that he was here,
Okay, so
and then
last
you
question,
can have
please.
doubts? Okay.
We are already running short of time. So please, question, no comment.
My name is Shakil Shahzada, I'm teacher. My two questions is, one question is about as you know, the rich Sindh culture is very rich and historical as far as music is concerned. Iktara and Bazanjis and this. My question is that this is time of the era as Alexander has impact any look like or any musical instrument, number one, or mention is there. And this, my question is, second is that the Alexander is just to occupy the area from world one side to other. Which area, which point or which ruler is to in sin with reference to just oppose and just war on tough wire in this area? Which area? You are historian all over the world, please mention here. Which impact of musical instrument as far as war is concerned? Thank you very much.
Do you want to respond, or should I close the session?
I found it rather difficult to understand the question, but...
Even I couldn't understand actually. Anyway,
no,
so thank you very much for raising this very important question. So let me close this session by thanking Dr. Myers, Dr. Stoneman, Dr. Wahab for sharing your research. And I believe this was very interesting session. It generated debate. So that's why we had a lot of questions from audience. So thank you very much.